It's the morning of August 14th, 2005. The skies over Greece are clear, blue and calm in a way that we pilots absolutely love. And high above the countryside, a Boeing 737 is holding with the image of a golden sun god called Helios in Greek painted across its blue tail. Everything about this aircraft, from the outside, looks perfectly normal, but something inside is very, very wrong. Over the radio, the controllers are calling Helios 522 Athens Center. You read over and over again, but with no reply. And to fully understand how this Boeing 737 could end up circling silently like a ghost plane over Athens, we need to leave the sky for a moment and go back to where this flight really began. Not in the cockpit and not even on the runway, but instead inside of a small airline operating at the edge of Europe's newly found low-cost boom. Helios Airways was, in the beginning of the 2000s, a relatively young carrier by airline standards. It had been founded in the late 1990s as the first privately owned airline in the island nation of Cyprus, and it was the very definition of a scrappy upstart low-cost carrier, operating only 4 airplanes. In a role familiar to those of us that know the European airline market, Helios promised to move holidaymakers between Cyprus, Greece and cities across Europe as cheaply and efficiently as possible. And like many budget airlines of the time, Helios proudly operated with thin margins, relied heavily on seasonal demand and pushed its aircraft hard during the busy summer months, with every aircraft needing to fly as much as possible to stay profitable. However, the airline's attitude towards safety was a little bit questionable. Turnover among flight crews and mechanics was big, and around 2005 Helios had already been under sustained scrutiny for some time by the UK Civil Aviation Authority. Now, if you're wondering why the UK regulators were overseeing an airline from a Mediterranean island country, well, it's because the UK had a number of military and administrative bases in Cyprus, but also because Cyprus's own aviation authority was very understaffed at the time and therefore had almost no actual oversight capability. Anyway, the UK CAA had conducted multiple audits on both the airline and its UK-based maintenance contractor, ATC La Cham, and what they had found pointed to a company barely holding itself together on paper. Manuals were outdated, incomplete, or with unclear origin, and investigators were stunned to learn that Helios didn't even have a contract with Boeing to receive official documentation updates for their aircraft. Instead, updates had been passed along from the airplane's previous owners and then selectively applied at Helios' discretion. Management openly admitted that only changes deemed important were incorporated, which was a practice that probably captured the airline's broader safety culture. Auditors also uncovered evidence that scheduled flight times were routinely shortened on paper to avoid triggering crew duty time limits, a practice that risked chronic fatigue among its flight crews. And beyond that, the airline lacked any meaningful quality control system. Emergency equipment was missing or incomplete, and internal operational oversight was virtually non-existent, with frontline staff left to manage most of their problems on their own. These deficiencies appeared again and again in successive audits, with little sign of lasting correction. So, by November of 2004, the UK CAA had warned Helios that its air operator certificate would be revoked unless the issues were permanently fixed. The airline then narrowly avoided grounding by addressing the listed discrepancies just days before the deadline, but the underlying culture that had allowed those issues to exist in the first place remained unchanged. In that environment, time was always in short supply. Aircraft arrived late at night and departed again before dawn, and crews rotated quickly, so the maintenance windows were compressed into the few quiet hours that still existed between flights, and any delays rippled through the system with little room to absorb them. Now, nothing about that was particularly unusual for such a tiny low-cost carrier, but it also meant that every decision, inspection and every sign-off mattered. From an operational and regulatory standpoint, though, Helios Airways existed in a kind of oversight no man's land, because since the airline was registered in Cyprus, the UK Civil Aviation Authority lacked the authority it needed to really enforce its findings. Helios was given failing grades on audits by the UKCA in 2003 and 2004 and 2005, and each time the UKCA merely informed the Cypriot authorities, who were so desperately understaffed that then they often just didn't follow up on these complaints. Which just meant that Helios was allowed to continue operating despite a pattern of unresolved issues. By 2005 though, Helios had two relatively new Boeing 737-800s, one leased Airbus A320 and a slightly older but newly acquired 737-300, registered as 5 Bravo Delta Bravo Yankee. It had been built back in 1998 and had then been delivered to Deutsche BA, where it flew until 2004 when it was registered in Cyprus and painted in the livery of Helios Airlines. It had been run hard, with over 16,000 flight cycles in the very short few years that it had been operational, and almost from the moment that Helios had introduced it to its fleet, it had developed a reputation for persistent, nagging problems that never quite seemed to be resolved. And they all centered around the aircraft's pressurization system. Quite a few times, crews had reported odd behavior and noises, and maintenance logs showed intermittent fault messages that appeared during climb just to disappear later, leaving little clues behind for the engineers to troubleshoot once the airplane was back down on the ground. And on top of that, in the summer of 2005 alone, there had been 7 different maintenance write-ups related to the cooling system for the airplane's electronics, powered by the air conditioning packs. Those are the same machines who provide the aircraft with its pressurization. Now, these problems weren't just restricted to fault codes, they were often very physical too. Cabin crew occasionally heard loud bangs near the rear of the aircraft, and on several flights, ice had been seen forming around the seal of the aft service door, which indicated that there was a leak big enough to let the cold outside air mix with the ambient air inside of the cabin. Now, none of those issues were directly dangerous on their own. They were more of a nuisance, because a cabin air leak might sound serious, but the reality is that aircraft leaks pressurization all of the time through seals and the toilets, and as a crew, you kind of get used to it. Some aircraft almost develop their own unique personalities, and when you fly them often, which is the case on a small fleet, we pilots learn which airplanes run a little bit warmer than others, which ones throw nuisance messages, and which ones need a little bit extra attention before they're released back into service. But it should also be said that this aircraft had had some more serious maintenance history too. In December of 2004, it had experienced a pressurization event serious enough to force the deployment of the oxygen masks in the cabin and demand an emergency descent. And that had happened after a series of bangs were heard and the flight attendant noticed a hole in one of the aft door seals large enough to put a hand through. Now after that, the aircraft had landed safely and it was returned back to service after some repairs had been made, but as far as we could find, the exact cause for this hole appearing was never identified properly. And as far as the paperwork was concerned, the issue had been addressed properly. Now, I'm explaining all of this because the history of this aircraft and the way that the pilots and engineers dealt with it was most likely very much relevant to what was soon about to happen. But one of the most challenging parts of these investigations isn't just understanding them, it's actually keeping track of all of the little details along the way, as well as keeping them in order. Between the technical final reports and expert interviews, critical details can often get lost when you try to take notes at the same time as you're listening and asking questions. So that's why I started using the Plod Note Pro, today's sponsor. Now this is now my dedicated note-taking assistant, and I use it all the time. You simply just press a button, place it on the table or on the back of your phone, and it will capture everything. But the real unlock comes afterwards. You see, this thing will transcribe the entire conversation, identify the speakers, and provide a structured AI summary with key actionable points. So instead of spending hours piecing everything together, I will have an organized overview ready in just a few seconds, which is super useful and a massive time saver. You can also use Ask Claude to query past recordings or draft follow-up emails based on the discussions that you've had, which is awesome. But maybe some of you will wonder, why not use a phone for this instead? Well, the truth is that the battery life quickly becomes a factor here, especially when you're using it in longer meetings, and the battery life is incredible in the Claude Note Pro, lasting over 50 hours. So I've actually only had to recharge it once in the past month. On top of that, your recordings also won't be interrupted by incoming calls or you needing your phone for something else. Of course, privacy is also a top priority when you're using these type of devices, and Claude meets global standards with enterprise-level security, which is essential when handling sensitive information. Now, they also offer the compact Notepin S if you prefer a sleeker option, so check them out using this QR code or by the link in the description. And remember to use the code PETTER10 for a 10% discount. Thank you, Claude. Now let's get back to the story. On the night of August 13th, 2005, 5 Bravo Delta Bravo Yankee was flying between London and Larnaca in Cyprus when the cabin crew yet again reported banging noises and ice build-up near the aft right passenger door. These banging sounds were most likely caused by air leaking past a damaged or stiffened door seal, because you see, at higher altitudes, pressurized air escaping through an imperfect seal can actually make the seals in themselves flutter a bit, sticking and releasing or momentarily shift against its fittings, producing sharp intermittent bangs rather than the continuous hiss that you'd expect from a leak. But that is very unpleasant and unsettling for the passengers, so after the flight, the cabin crew complained about it to the pilots, who wrote a line in the technical log, one that would set a chain of events off leading up to this story. The captain wrote, "Aft service door requires full inspection." Now, like I mentioned before, this wasn't unusual for this aircraft, but anything that's written into the aircraft's technical log has to be either deferred according to set procedures or rectified before the next flight, so it now couldn't be ignored. So this meant that when the aircraft arrived in Larnaca in the early hours of August 14th, there were only a few hours left to spare before its next departure. The following morning, it was scheduled to carry more than 100 passengers over to Athens and then proceed onwards towards Prague, so whatever had caused the banging and ice near the aft door needed to be understood and signed off before then. And this in turn meant that there was now quite some pressure on the overnight maintenance crew, led by a licensed British engineer who was well familiar with this aircraft and its history. And from his perspective, the tech log entry pointed towards a familiar suspect. If air was leaking past the aft service door seal at cruise altitude, the cause was likely just an issue with that seal rather than something structural with the aircraft's fuselage. And this in turn meant that the leak was subtle and intermittent, and more importantly, it was something that might not show up unless the airplane was pressurized. So the engineering team started by visually inspecting the aft service door from both the inside and outside, opening and closing it several times. They checked the seals, the latching mechanism and the surrounding structure, but nothing obvious stood out. The door sealed itself as it should, it's seated properly in the frame, and all of the seals around it appeared intact, which was a little bit of a problem. You see, when a pressurization leak only appears at altitude, a simple walk around on the ground often just isn't enough to find it. At higher altitudes, the pressure difference between the inside and the outside of the cabin can be as high as 8.35 pounds per square inch, which means that there are thousands of kilos of air pressure pressing against the door and holding it closed. Now, rubber seals stiffen in the cold, so small imperfections can become significant, and a door that looks perfectly normal on the ramp can behave very differently once the aircraft climbs into the thin, frigid air in the cruise. But before we go any further here, it's probably worth explaining why all of this talk of seals and pressurization is so important. At cruising altitude, the air pressure outside an airliner is far too low for the human body to be able to function. Up there, our lungs can only process about a quarter of the oxygen that would be able to take up at sea level, so without assistance, a person would lose consciousness in seconds. That assistance can either come from adding oxygen to the air we breathe or by artificially increase the pressure. And since it's much more convenient to do the latter, that is what airliners do. But they don't fly around as perfectly sealed pressure vessels. Instead, airliners maintain this pressure by constantly pumping in compressed air and then carefully controlling how much of it is allowed to escape. Now, the goal isn't to mimic the pressure at sea level, but instead to hold at an equivalent altitude of around 6,000 to 8,000 feet, where passengers and crew can breathe normally, but without the pressure difference between the inside and the outside becoming so high that structural integrity can become a problem. Now, on most jet airliners, including the Boeing 737, the air needed to achieve this comes from the engines. This is known as bleed air, and it's tapped from the 5th and 9th stages of the engine's compressor, where it's hot and highly pressurized. It's then cooled, conditioned, and routed into the cabin and cockpit through the help of 2 air conditioning packs. And after that, it then flows continuously through the fuselage and out through 3 different controllable openings: the exhaust port, the forward outflow valve, and the aft outflow valve. Now, just to make it simple, I will mainly talk about the aft outflow valve here, since it's the most important one of those. So, by opening or closing that one, the pressurization system can raise or lower the pressure inside of the cabin in a smooth and controlled way as the aircraft climbs and descends, and thereby alter the cabin altitude. So, for example, with the outflow valve open, the inside pressure goes down and the cabin altitude goes up, and vice versa. Now, as a side note here, investigators were later able to determine that the main outflow valve had been forced to compensate for leaks in the cabin by staying further closed than normal on all of the last 74 flights on this aircraft, just pointing at those previous issues that I mentioned. In any case, during normal circumstances, the control of the cabin altitude happens automatically. The pilot just sets the intended cruise altitude and landing altitude in the pressurization panel, and the system then manages everything else, carefully controlling how much air leaves the cabin to maintain a safe and comfortable internal pressure. But there is also a manual setting, which can be used if the 2 automatic controllers would fail. In that setting, the pilots can control the outflow valve manually, whilst carefully monitoring the cabin altitude, and this will activate a green manual light on the panel. But having to do that is exceedingly rare. So, in reality, the pressurization mode selector was almost always set to auto, which is worth remembering here. And that also takes us back to the engineers, so we're now trying to figure out what was wrong with that aft door. To test for leaks, in this case around the door, the engineers made a decision to run a pressurization test. And to do that, they needed to increase the pressure inside of the cabin to 23 psi, or 8.25 psi above the ambient pressure. That would create an environment similar to the pressure difference that the aircraft would encounter while flying at higher altitudes, and it was a fairly routine test to do. It was described step by step in the aircraft's maintenance manual, and in order to force pressurize the aircraft on the ground, the outflow valve now needed to be closed. So, inside of the cockpit, the lead technician therefore moved the pressurization mode selector from auto over to manual, which allowed them to seal the cabin and control how the pressure increased. Bleed air from the auxiliary power unit was then routed through the air conditioning packs, and the cabin began to pressurize just as it would during a climb. The pressure rose gradually, and while one maintenance technician positioned himself in the cabin near the aft service door, another one stood outside on top of some stairs, listening closely for any telltale hissing, popping or banging. Now, the test was carried out all of the way up to the normal operating pressure, and then beyond it until the aircraft's overpressure safety valve opened up at a designated pressure differential of 8.65 psi. But even after having done that, they still found nothing, and just couldn't replicate the issues that the plane had been having on the previous flight. Now, in one sense, this was good news. The airplane appeared structurally sound and there was no obvious defect demanding immediate repair, but in another, it was deeply frustrating. The problem that this cabin crew had reported was something that had now been documented several times, but had once again failed to reveal itself under controlled conditions. So, with no fault to fix, the engineers began depressurizing the aircraft, carefully managing the rate to avoid discomfort for those inside. And that was especially after one technician had already complained that they were descending too fast and that his ears were hurting. Now, it was later found that this test had not been done exactly according to the description in the maintenance manual. The test pressure had been run too high and with the use of 2 packs instead of 1, and the engineer at the back had not been provided with a copy of the task showing exactly what he was supposed to look for. In any case, once they were done, the test was completed and documented in the logbook, albeit not in the detailed way that it should have been, and the engineer in charge then signed off that the aft service door and its surroundings had no defects, at least that they could detect, and that the pressurization system had performed exactly as expected. By the time that he had filled that in, the night was already over and the aircraft was released back into service. So the maintenance crew just moved on to their next task, confident that they had done what the situation required. But one small detail had been left out of place, one that would soon matter more than anyone could ever imagine. Now, exactly what happened here is up for some debate, because the chief engineer insisted that he finished this test by switching the pressurization mode selector from manual back into auto. But all evidence, including how the system later performed and how the switch was eventually found, point to the switch having been left in manual. Which would mean that the cabin outflow valve would still be under manual control and would therefore not allow normal automatic pressurization unless it was put back into auto again. By the time the engineers had finished everything and stepped away from the aircraft, the night was already giving way to morning. Larnaca Airport, on the south side of the island of Cyprus, was just beginning to stir, and among the first arrivals to the airport that morning were the crew who was going to operate Helios Flight 522. Now, according to their schedule, they were supposed to fly the 737 first through a short hop from Cyprus over to Athens and then onwards towards Prague, making it a pretty nice duty overall. Now, the pilots who had been scheduled to operate this duty were fairly experienced. The captain was 59 years old and had 16,900 hours, and with 5,500 of those being flown on the 737. He had started his career in East Germany and had, during the years before this flight, shifted companies almost every other year, which for someone like me raises a few questions. You see, generally, you only change airlines that often, either if you are very unlucky or because there is some other problem present, like training issues or CRM. Now, he was described by his family as a quiet person who liked to build and fly model airplanes, but some first officers in Helios had complained about his manners in the cockpit, specifically that he could be a bit harsh and that he sometimes didn't follow standard operating procedures. His first officer on this day, who was one of the ones who had privately complained about this captain, by the way, was 51 years old and had an experience of just over 7,500 hours. 4,000 of which were flown on the 737. He had started his career as a mechanic before he was bitten by the bug and eventually became a first officer on the Lockheed Electra. Now, while he was qualified and quite experienced, his training records noted that he sometimes struggled a bit with discipline and attention to details was going through checklists, especially under stress. Anyway, for both of these pilots, this should have been a quite routine day. The weather was excellent, there were no specific NOTAMs, and the maintenance log showed no open items that would prevent dispatch. It is, however, unclear if the captain noticed the tech log entries left from the night's tests, and we do know that there was no normal or formal handoff from the lead engineer, meaning that he didn't come out and explain things to the captain as would normally be done. Anyway, the pilots were also joined on the flight by 4 cabin crew, including one that had been called off from standby to fill in for a colleague that had been calling in sick. And together with the 115 passengers, this brought the total souls on board up to 121 for the first flight. From the cockpit, nothing at this point would have appeared unusual. The first officer, who would be pilot flying, started setting up the aircraft whilst the captain did the walk-around, and the initial cockpit preparation of course included configuring all of the key systems, including the air conditioning system, as well as programming the FMC with the complete routing that they were planning to use. Now, going through the pre-flight setup is a highly routine task to do on the 737. It includes several scan flows, which are done from memory in a certain order stipulated by Boeing, and whilst every movement of a switch and check of a light requires careful attention, it is often done in quite a rapid fashion, especially if there is some type of time pressure present, which means that there is a big risk of things becoming a bit too routine. So, switches not in the correct position could be missed if you don't pay full attention, or if it's a switch who is rarely touched, or some other type of distraction is introduced. In any case, the idea is that any omission in a critical system should then be highlighted by the use of our checklists. And in the case of the pre-flight checklist, they contained around 80 different items, several of which did cover the pressurization panel. But here we come to one of many peculiarities of the Boeing 737. You see, the checklist item used for the life-supporting pressurization system used to challenge air condition and pressurization, effectively covering two whole panels with the same challenge. Now, the response from the pilot flying to that challenge should be Pax Auto, bleeds on, set. And the set there was supposed to include both the cruise and landing altitude on the pressurization panel and the position of the pressurization mode selector. But since that switch almost never was anywhere else than in the auto position, a lot of crews just concentrated on the values that they had manually entered in the two windows instead, and not on the switch. But of course, on this morning, the pressurization mode selector was not in auto. It was still set to manual, exactly where it had been left after the overnight pressure test. And that now went unnoticed. Oh, and by the way, remember those updates to manuals that Helios hadn't bothered to apply because they didn't think that they were important? Well, one of those would have rewritten the before start checklist to explicitly require verification of the pressurization mode selector's position, rather than just that vague pressurization set. Now, another reason why the crew might not have reacted to the manual position was, like I mentioned earlier, that the manual light, which illuminated next to the switch when it was in the manual position, was green, which is the color normally associated with normal operation rather than any type of danger. Investigators also noted that with the first officer sometimes recorded poor attention to detail, he might have called set without the actual position of the switch ever being truly processed. And exactly for that reason, checklists are only effective when they are paired with proper verification by both pilots. So rhyming of checklists, which is when you just call out what the response should be rather than what it actually is a big problem in the business, and something that I have spent countless hours instructing new pilots on in the sim. Unfortunately though, in this aircraft, the cockpit voice recorder only captured the last 30 minutes of the conversations, so it therefore didn't cover this phase of flight, which means that the investigators were never able to determine exactly how the pressurization mode selector escaped detection. But we do know that it was left in manual. And so, after the checklist had been completed, the two engines were started in sequence and the air conditioning packs were put to auto to start providing air for the air conditioning and pressurization. And this caused the bleed air to start flowing into the aircraft, just as it always did, making all of the familiar sounds that the pilots were used to. Nothing suggested that the system responsible for keeping the cabin breathable at altitude was now still in manual control. But even though these first important checks had now been missed, there were still several more safety barriers left, specifically designed to stop an omission like this from becoming dangerous. And for them to also be passed, further mistakes and another curiosity of the 737 systems needed to enter the scene. Helios Flight 522 soon taxied out from its stand under the warm morning sun. The pilots were subsequently cleared for departure, and at time 0807 the aircraft lined up on runway 22. The first officer moved the thrust levers forward, and the gleaming 737 started accelerating smoothly down the runway and then rotated into the air. The gear was then retracted and the aircraft started banking gently away from the runway, pointing the nose northwest towards Greece. The climb was smooth, with no clear indication of anything being out of the ordinary. The air was calm, and from the cockpit perspective, everything still appeared routine. All of the engine parameters were normal, the autopilot was engaged, and the aircraft accelerated cleanly through its initial climb and retracted the flaps. But this normality was just a facade. As the 737 continued climbing, the air pressure outside was slowly decreasing, as it always did. But with the pressurization system still in manual mode, the electrically operated outflow valve now remained partially open, allowing air to escape from the cabin almost as fast as it was being pumped in, like a giant balloon with a hole in it. Now, under normal circumstances, this should not have gone unnoticed for long. The after-takeoff checklist includes a specific step where we pilots need to verify that the cabin pressurization is occurring normally. And we do so by checking the cabin altitude, the differential pressure, and the cabin rate of climb indications on the pressurization panel. During a normal climb, the cabin altitude after takeoff should have just increased a little tiny bit, whilst the differential pressure should be increasing steadily, and the cabin climb would sit at around 500 to 1000 feet per minute. But with the aircraft not pressurizing, the cabin altitude would be similar to the aircraft's actual altitude, and there would be little to no differential pressure. And on top of that, the cabin climb rate would also be similar to the aircraft's, sitting at around 2,500 to 3,000 feet per minute if the aircraft was still climbing. So, for this flight to continue climbing with the system still misconfigured, that important check must now have also completely failed. As with the earlier checklist items, the cockpit voice recorder didn't capture this phase of flight either, so investigators were unable to determine exactly how this was missed. The only thing that they could determine was that one more chance to catch this problem had now come and gone. This time with the captain in charge of doing the checklist, as he was pilot monitoring. Now, at first, the differences that this would have caused in the cabin would have been quite subtle. Passengers and crew would have noticed nothing unusual, except maybe some more noticeable pops in their ears and sinuses, as the cabin would have climbed much faster than what they were used to. But the air conditioning packs were still producing a steady flow of cool, clean outside air, and there would have been no sudden loss of pressure or dramatic decompression, just a slow, steady failure to pressurize, something that we pilots refer to as a subtle decompression. At time 0611 and 21 seconds, the captain called up Nicosia ACC and advised that Helios Flight 522 was climbing through flight level 100 for 200. The controller responded and asked what cruise level that they requested, to which the captain responded, flight level 340. And only a few seconds later, the controller cleared them to climb to flight level 340 as final, which would have meant that the autopilot was now set up for a continuous climb all the way up, which is worth keeping in mind. Now, in my airline, we do a secondary pressurization check as we climb through 10,000 feet, but there was no mention of something like that being done on board Flight 522. Now, the reason we do that is because 10,000 feet is the threshold above which the first signs of hypoxia can start to creep in, and is therefore also the cabin altitude where a warning is set to be activated. So at time 0812, as the aircraft climbed through roughly 12,000 feet, the cabin altitude, who was trailing just slightly behind the real aircraft's altitude, reached 10,000 feet, and that warning horn now went off. This was the cue for all trained pilots to immediately don their oxygen masks and revert to something known as memory items for cabin altitude warning or rapid depressurization. But on the Boeing 737, this same horn actually serves two different purposes. On the ground, if that warning is heard, it represents the takeoff configuration warning, alerting us pilots to the fact that something critical like flaps or trim is not set correctly for departure. But in the air, that same horn is used to warn us of excessive cabin altitude, which is now what was happening here. But that meant that the exact same sound was triggered by two completely different problems, separated only by context. So why? Why was that then? Well, back when the Boeing 737 was designed in the early 1960s, cockpit warning sounds weren't digital files that could be selected in the way that later aircraft could. No, each alert required a physical horn with its own wiring, power and panel space. So, to cut complexity in an already crowded cockpit, Boeing chose to reuse the same horn for multiple warnings, relying on the phase of flight to remove any ambiguity. This meant that as this horn now went off, it did so because the cabin altitude had climbed through 10,000 feet, which to the original designers of the aircraft meant such a dramatically different scenario than the takeoff configuration warning that no one should ever confuse the two. But that assumption was built on a faulty premise of the human nature. One that took for granted that humans always react based on logic and not things like familiarity and habits. You see, to pilots, this horn is far more familiar in a very different, specific context. During the pre-flight checks at the gate, we pilots routinely test the takeoff configuration warning by advancing the thrust levels to, a high setting, but with the engines still not running and the flaps still retracted. And by doing that, that reliably reproduces this exact same horn, showing us that the takeoff configuration system warning works. But it also means that crews hears that warning in that context, as a takeoff configuration warning every single day. And by contrast, the cabin altitude warning is not tested in the same way, which means that most pilots will only hear that during simulator training, sometimes many years apart. So over time, this had created a powerful association. That horn now meant takeoff configuration warning, not pressurization warning, and the result here was that when this warning now activated, the pilots didn't immediately don their oxygen masks as the procedure demanded. Instead, they misinterpreted this as an erroneous takeoff configuration warning, which needed to be fixed somehow. Now this is an explanation, not an excuse. They were, after all, flying an aircraft with a history of pressurization problems, and a quick look at the tech log during the pre-flight would have shown the previous captain's notes and the following maintenance actions to the captain. But, like I said earlier, there hadn't been any official handover from the engineers to this new crew during the morning, and also, this captain was known for not always following procedures, and the first officer was known for missing things under pressure. So maybe you can start to see how the holes in the Swiss cheese model now started lining up, with safety barrier after safety barrier being crossed. Anyway, after interpreting the horn as a takeoff configuration warning, one of the pilots now disconnected the automatics and then briefly reduced the thrust levels towards idle. Whoever did that would have known that this warning shouldn't sound in the air, and on the ground it's only armed when the thrust levels are advanced, so pulling the thrust levels back was a reasonable attempt to reset or maybe confirm what they believed was a false configuration alert. But then when the horn didn't stop, that still didn't prompt the crew to question their initial assumption. Instead, it seemed to reinforce the idea that something about the aircraft's configuration or systems just didn't make any sense, even though the exact cause to them remained unclear. Moments later, the autopilot and autothrottle was re-engaged and the climb continued, with the warning unresolved and still sounding in the background, which also likely added to their stress. Now, if you think that this mistake was a tragic oddity, you would be wrong. In fact, during the years leading up to this event, several 737 crews from around the world had made the very same mistake, with consequences coming uncomfortably close to mirroring what was now about to happen. In one of the most serious ones, a Boeing 737 departing from Ireland in 2002 failed to pressurize after takeoff, and as it climbed, the cabin altitude warning horn sounded, with the crew also assuming that they were dealing with a takeoff configuration problem. A flight attendant then tried to alert the pilots to growing discomfort in the cabin, but was told to stand by while they tried to diagnose what they believed was a nuisance warning. And it was only when the cabin altitude reached around 14,000 feet that the captain noticed that the air conditioning packs had never been turned on. Switching them back on then immediately restored pressurization, averting a further incident, but Irish investigators later wrote that the potential for a full-scale accident was self-evident. A warning that unfortunately went largely unnoticed. A similar incident then also happened in the US, when a 737 cruising at 37,000 feet experienced a slow loss of pressurization. When the warning horn finally sounded, both pilots initially assumed that it was the takeoff configuration warning, possibly linked to another sensor issue that they were already investigating. And it was only after a while that the first officer suddenly remembered that the takeoff configuration warning and the cabin altitude warning had the same sound, which made him realize what was now actually happening. The crew then quickly initiated an emergency descent and landed safely, but severely shaken by how close they had come, the captain later filed a confidential report, saying that if the first officer hadn't made that connection, they might have continued troubleshooting until they lost consciousness. And that is actually another good point to raise here. You see, since this warning only activates when the cabin already is at or above 10,000 feet, hypoxia will quickly become a problem as the cabin continues to climb. And hypoxia will severely affect things like logical thinking, decision-making and focus, making it even harder to change a course of action based on a faulty diagnosis. In any case, those two separate cases were only the most dramatic examples of at least a half a dozen known incidents involving this same fundamental design flaw. And the reports from those incidents had reached Boeing, who by 2004 was clearly aware of the issue. But rather than redesigning the whole system, Boeing instead added guidance in the flight crew training manual, warning pilots that the two alerts sounded identical. And that revision was scheduled to take effect in October of 2005, which unfortunately was too late for the passengers and crew in this story. In the skies over Cyprus, instead of initiating an emergency descent, the captain now made a radio call, not to air traffic control, but instead back to Helios operations on the ground. And by coincidence, the maintenance technician who took that call was the same one who had performed the pressurization tests during the night before. And as he made this call, other cues were now beginning to appear in the cockpit as to the true nature of the problem. But the captain still struggled to understand what was actually going wrong. His attention instead fixed on another indication that seemed abnormal: the equipment cooling off lights who had just now illuminated. You see, on the 737, the equipment cooling system uses cabin air to ventilate the avionics bay beneath the cockpit, and if it detects insufficient airflow or air density, two lights labeled equipment cooling off illuminate to indicate that this important cooling has now been lost. So as Flight 522 climbed through roughly 16,000 feet, with the cabin altitude now above 12,000 and still rising, those lights had illuminated, together with the master caution warning. So the captain now reported this symptom to the engineer, telling him that both my equipment cooling lights are off. In reality, the warning lights labeled off were illuminated, but the captain's phrasing, likely influenced by his limited English, conveyed the complete opposite meaning, that the lights were off, which they should be, which greatly confused the engineer down on the ground. So he now asked the captain to clarify what he meant, but the captain just responded, "They are not switched off," to which he likely meant that he had not turned the equipment cooling system off, and therefore the lights off shouldn't have been illuminated. But this still didn't make any sense to the engineer. So the two men now kept talking past each other, whilst for every second the unpressurized aircraft climbed higher and higher. After a while though, the engineer began to suspect what might be really going on, so he asked one simple, direct question. Was the pressurization system set to automatic? But he didn't get any clear answer to that. Back in the cabin, the passenger oxygen masks now deployed automatically as the cabin altitude passed 14,000 feet, and that, if anything, should have been the final cue these pilots needed in order to figure out what was going on. But yet again, fate and poor training intervened. You see, when we pilots are dealing with technical issues in the 737, it's super important that we follow structured and well-defined steps. The pilot flying should concentrate on flying the aircraft, whilst the pilot monitoring should focus on troubleshooting the issue. And once a specific malfunction is identified through the master caution system, and of course some kind of action is defined, the master caution light must then be reset. The reason for this is that this arms the system for any other faults that might appear, but if the system is not reset, it will just stay illuminated, blocking the indication of something else happening. And that was now exactly what happened in this cockpit. The master caution light had activated when the equipment cooling off lights had illuminated, but instead of calling that out and starting the QRH non-normal checklist, the captain had chosen to talk to the engineer instead and hadn't reset the system. So when the passenger oxygen system then activated with its own amber warning light in the overhead panel, this was never highlighted and likely therefore missed by both pilots, finally sealing everyone's fate. At time 0820, the captain asked the engineer where the equipment cooling circuit breakers were, with the technician then telling him that they were located behind his seat. And that exchange would be the last thing that anyone would ever hear from Helios Flight 522. As the aircraft climbed through 20,000 feet, the cabin altitude followed it upwards, and with it, the effects of hypoxia now took over. Within minutes, both pilots would have lost useful consciousness, with the first officer slumping over his controls and the captain likely collapsing on the floor behind his seat, as he was still looking for circuit breakers that had nothing to do with the situation. And this, of course, left the aircraft entirely in the hands of its automated systems. So, with the autopilot engaged and cleared to climb to flight level 340, and the flight management system programmed for the whole route over to Athens, including the anticipated arrival, approach and missed approach, Flight 522 just continued climbing exactly as commanded, with an eerie silence inside of the cockpit. The aircraft soon leveled off cleanly at its assigned cruising altitude, and to anyone watching it from the ground, it appeared to be just another early morning airliner crossing the Mediterranean. But of course, inside of the cabin, the situation was now becoming truly bizarre. The passenger oxygen masks, which had deployed automatically, are connected to oxygen generators, so when they are activated will chemically create oxygen for about 12 to 15 minutes or so. Now that's normally more than enough to keep everyone conscious during an emergency descent down to the MSA or 10,000 feet, whichever is higher. But every one of those pressurization emergency scenarios was of course planned around a descent. So, with no descent initiated, those minutes now just passed by very quickly, and one by one, the cabin crew and the passengers would have lost consciousness as the oxygen generators were exhausted. And that would have finally left the cabin in a strange, motionless stillness. People sitting in their seats, still alive, but unconscious. Now, an important question here is what the cabin crew were doing. And again, given that we don't really have any cockpit voice recording of this phase of the flight, we don't know if they tried to contact the cockpit during those minutes that they were on normal oxygen. You see, the crew would have been well trained for a loss of pressurization scenario, so they would have expected the aircraft to level off while they were taking on their oxygen masks and sitting down, and then that should have been followed by a rapid descent. But this aircraft now continued to climb instead, which must have raised some real alarm bells for the crew. But the problem here was that when the captain had left his chair to look for those circuit breakers, the cabin altitude would have been almost as high as Mount Everest, so unless the crew had tried to call before then, they likely wouldn't have received a response from the pilots, since they would have already been unconscious. Remember, they were not on any type of oxygen. In any case, all we know for sure is that Flight 522 now just continued flying towards Greece. Back in Larnaca, Helios dispatch attempted to reach Flight 522 directly but received no response. And they then contacted the area control center in Nicosia, hoping that air traffic control might succeed where they couldn't. But even though the Nicosia controllers tried several times to call the aircraft, both on its assigned frequency, the emergency frequency 121.5, and even through relay calls from nearby traffic, every attempt went unanswered. But despite that silence, radar returns still show the 737 holding its assigned altitude and tracking precisely along its planned route, and to the controllers this was kind of reassuring, because that was exactly what pilots were trained to do in the event of a radio failure. Now sure, that should have also included them squawking 7600 on their transponder, but aside from that, everything kind of looked okay. So that textbook behavior made this initially look like a routine communication problem, one that would hopefully resolve itself with time. Now, to test whether the crew might still be receiving their instructions even if they couldn't transmit, the Nicosia controller asked Flight 522 to change its transponder code, but nothing happened. The flight soon crossed into Greek airspace, flying directly towards the Rhodes VOR before it started making a shallow turn towards the next programmed waypoints, Ripley and Varix. And the responsibility for the flight was now handed over to the Greek air traffic controllers, who took over and began calling the aircraft, repeating the same question over and over. Helios 522, do you read? But there was never any reply. By time 0912, 52 minutes after the last transmission from the captain, the aircraft approached the reporting point Ripley, where its descent towards Athens would have normally begun. So, in the off chance that the pilots could still hear instructions, the controller now issued a descent clearance. But again, there was no reply, and the aircraft made no attempt to start descending. Remember, the flight management system had been programmed all the way to Athens, but without a command from the pilots, the autopilot could not start a descent. It would just maintain whatever cruise altitude that they had set in their mode control panel. So, still at 34,000 feet, Flight 522 soon passed over Varix and then the Kia VOR on the island of Kia, before finally beginning a gentle turn, lining up with the standard instrument approach course to Athens. Except it did so while still maintaining 34,000 feet. And for those tracking this flight, that moment marked a shift from concern over to cold desperation, because the fact that the aircraft wasn't descending was a step away from normal loss of comm procedures, so this must be something else. Phones now started ringing across operations rooms, supervisors were called in and the military authorities were notified, all whilst the 737 continued cruising along. With no further instructions available in the flight plan, the autopilot did exactly what it was designed to do. Since the aircraft hadn't landed, it now just followed the published missed approach procedure, which led it into a holding pattern, turning the aircraft into wide, perfectly flown ovals southeast of Athens back over the Kia VOR. And it then kept doing that over and over, waiting for someone to tell it what to do next. And it was at this point, as the controllers were watching the aircraft circle again and again, that one possibility began to dominate the conversation: crew incapacitation. From the ground, there was no way to know whether the pilots were unconscious, attempting to troubleshoot, or facing some other type of emergency, because the radar could now really only show position, altitude and speed, and in all three respects, Flight 522 looked disturbingly normal, as the holding pattern just continued. 5 times the aircraft circled, tracing the same path through the sky, burning fuel at a steady cruise rate with its engines humming, systems powered and the autopilot engaged. The Hellenic Air Force were now ordered to scramble 2 F-16s from the NEA and Helios Airbase, both to visually inspect the airliner and to determine whether there was any sign of life or if it posed some type of threat. By now, this was the only way to find out what was really happening on board Flight 522. And as the fighters climbed to intercept altitude and then turned towards the holding pattern north of Athens, the Boeing 737 just continued circling in silence. When the fighters reached the aircraft at time 10:32, it had already completed 5 circuits in its pre-programmed holding pattern and was now beginning its 6th. The air was clear, visibility excellent, so the intercept itself was pretty straightforward. The F-16 slid into positions alongside the airliner, close enough for one of the pilots to look directly through the cockpit windows. And what he saw there immediately ruled out a simple radio failure. He reported that the captain's seat was empty, and it appeared as the first officer was slumped forward in his chair, motionless, with his head almost resting against the controls. Initially, there was no further sign of movement in the cockpit, no attempt to acknowledge the intercept, and no response to the fighter pilots' standard visual signals that they were doing. This included rocking their wings, maneuvering into the crew's field of view, and even releasing flares, but nothing was working. This was now truly a ghost flight. One of the F-16 pilots then maneuvered his aircraft aft along the fuselage, peering through the cabin windows as he passed, and inside he could see oxygen masks dangling from the ceiling throughout the cabin. The passengers were visible in their seats, completely still, with no sign of smoke, fire, or any type of structural damage, just a silent aircraft, perfectly intact, flying by itself. He reported this observation to the ground in real time. This was definitely not a hijacking. There was no signs of visible struggle, but still no one appeared conscious. Down on the ground, the implications of this message were immediate and devastating. Air traffic controllers, military officers, and government officials now all shared the understanding that everyone on board Helios Flight 522 were likely incapacitated, possibly permanently because long exposure to severe hypoxia can cause permanent damage to the brain. So, what could they now possibly do, and could the aircraft pose a threat to people down on the ground? In any case, the F-16 pilots stayed with the aircraft, watching closely for any sign of change, any movement in the cockpit or cabin that could mean that someone on board might still be conscious. And then, unseen by the fighter pilots within the dead stillness of the cabin, someone did begin to move. At time 08:48 and 31 seconds, 2 chimes were suddenly heard inside the cockpit, and 20 seconds later, another 2. This was then followed by a continuous, insistent alarm that echoed through the silent cockpit for roughly 20 more seconds, and after that came a small, unmistakable click sound, recorded forever on the cockpit voice recorder. The flight deck door had unlocked, and it now swung open just a couple of seconds later. And through the front windows, the intercept pilots now saw something incredible. And they radioed back to home base, explaining that he is wearing a vest and a blue shirt. He doesn't seem to have a pilot uniform. He has a portable oxygen bottle. And the person they were talking about, the person who was now sliding into the captain's seat, reaching forward and putting his hands on the controls, was 24-year-old flight attendant Andreas Prodmorou. Investigators believe that he must have grabbed one of the large portable oxygen bottles next to his jump seat when he realized that the oxygen generators were about to run out. Now, he was a trained scuba diver, and this fact, together with his cabin crew training, would have meant that he was able to set up the portable oxygen bottle relatively quickly. And that in turn meant that for the first time in hours, there was now visible human life on board Helios Flight 522. Which from the outside must have been both astonishing and heartbreaking. The F-16 pilots now tightened their formation, rocking their wings and flashing their lights, trying to draw Prodmourou's attention, looking for any signs that he could see or hear them. But initially, he didn't look their way. Whatever he was doing up there, he was doing it alone, in a situation that must have been beyond surrealistic. This meant that the fighters could only relay what they were seeing back to controllers on the ground as the 737 continued to trace its holding pattern over northern Greece. But if Andreas had an oxygen bottle, why had it taken him so long to reach the flight deck? Well, part of the answer might be the reinforced cockpit door. That had been required after the 9/11 attacks and was designed to stay locked unless actively opened from the inside of the cockpit or unlocked via a keypad sequence from the outside. The investigators believe that he might have spent some time trying to find the lead flight attendant who would have had the override code in her pocket. Of course, there is also the tragic possibility that Andreas didn't go straight for the cockpit. His girlfriend was one of the other crew members on board, and it is entirely reasonable to assume that he first tried to help her and perhaps others before making his way towards the cockpit. If so, those attempts were obviously futile and would have also cost him time and oxygen, but none of that makes his eventual success in reaching the cockpit less remarkable. It actually makes it more so. When he finally did get inside, the magnitude of what he was facing would have been almost impossible to imagine. But out of all of the people on board, he was probably the best one to have made it. You see, Andreas was also a trained private pilot, which meant that all of the instruments and levers inside might have been at least somewhat familiar to him. But by this point, the aircraft was on its 10th circuit, and the fuel, which had been meant only for a short hop from Cyprus to Athens plus reserves, was now nearly gone. So Andreas would have had only seconds really to understand what configuration the aircraft was in, what systems were still running, and what options, if any, still remained. To land that 737 safely would have required him to get his head around the autopilot system, initiate a descent, and then hopefully also get into contact with the controllers who could have found someone down on the ground to help him. And that might all have been theoretically possible if there would have been enough time, but there wasn't. Less than a minute after he had entered the flight deck, the left engine ran out of fuel and flamed out. And as soon as that happened, the automatic electrical switching inside of the 737, which would have definitely occurred then, would have disconnected the autopilot. So from that moment, Andreas would have had to fly the aircraft manually at high altitude and with one engine failed. What this also meant was, with the asymmetric thrust coming from the remaining engine, the 737 now yawed and began a sharp turn to the left before rolling out again on a northwesterly heading, no longer neatly contained inside of the holding pattern. And now, with only one engine producing power, the aircraft also couldn't maintain 34,000 feet. So within a short while, the nose started dipping and the aircraft began to descend, first gently and then with an increased nose-down attitude, trading altitude for airspeed as it headed towards the coast. Within minutes, the aircraft passed over the island of Evia, descending rapidly through airspace that it had passed hours earlier without incident. Notably though, it now continued on a relatively stable northwesterly track rather than falling into an uncontrolled spiral, which was a detail that the investigators later took as strong evidence that Andreas Prodmorou was actively flying the airplane at this stage, but with obvious difficulty. One of the F-16 pilots now slid in close once more, searching the cockpit for any sign that the situation had changed in any way, and through the windshield he could see that the first officer was now sitting upright, as if Andreas, by the controls, had tried to wake him up, but the people in the cockpit were still not acknowledging the fighter jet. The cockpit voice recorder now also captured something that the fighters couldn't hear, a weak, exhausted voice calling out, "Mayday, mayday, mayday! Helios Airways Flight 522, Athens! Mayday, mayday!" Now Andreas never pressed the transmit button on the yoke as this call was made, and even if he had, the radio was at this point tuned to the wrong frequency, so this mayday call was never sent out. It was only captured for posterity on the cockpit voice recorder. Moments later, the aircraft turned sharply left again, crossing back over Eubea for a second time as the descent rate now rose into the thousands of feet per minute. The altitude decreased rapidly, and as the aircraft descended through roughly 7,000 feet, the right engine finally also ran out of fuel and flamed out. In that instant, Helios Flight 522 became a glider, but not one configured for a controlled descent and not flown by a trained crew with time checklists and coordination. No, this was an airliner, flown with no thrust, little energy, and almost no altitude left to spend, with a poor, untrained cabin crew at the controls. Controls who now likely were also left without any hydraulic power to support them because both engines had failed, making controlling the aircraft incredibly hard. Now the fighters stayed within visual range, but now backed away to a safe distance, watching intently. And then, for the first time since entering the cockpit, Andreas Prodmorov acknowledged the fighter pilots, responding faintly to a hand signal and confirming that he was aware of their presence. The F-16 pilot had no idea of how much control Andreas had at this point, so he signaled for him to follow, pointing down towards the airport and offering the only remaining option. But the reply was devastating in its simplicity. Andreas just pointed downward, as if to say that the airplane was going down and that there were nothing left to be done. Helios Flight 522 now crossed back into mainland Greece and turned sharply left once more, descending towards the rugged hills lining the coast northeast of Athens. Recognizing that a crash was inevitable, the fighters broke away at the last moment, radioing that it's going for the terrain. Inside the cockpit, Andreas Prodmorov pulled back instinctively, a final attempt to raise the nose and to soften what was coming, but with no flaps, degrading airspeed and likely with very heavy controls, his efforts simply didn't make much of a difference. At times 09, 03 and 32 seconds, Helios Flight 522 struck the ground on the side of Grammatiko Hill, 32 kilometers north of Athens. It careened up a ridge, over a ravine, into another ridge and partially up and over that as well, as it was breaking up. Seconds later, the call came from one of the fighters. "We have the impact." And there would be no survivors. In the days that followed, the investigators tried to figure out how a fully loaded airliner could become a ghost plane flown entirely by its autopilot. After piecing together the black box data, the positions of switches in the cockpit and the non-volatile memory extracted from the pressurization system controls, they were forced to come to a grim conclusion. The pressurization system had been left in manual, with the outflow valve partially open, meaning that the plane never pressurized itself. And after having completely missed this, and with limited time left to discover the real problem, the pilot's distractions and the hypoxia-induced loss of reasoning skills had consumed the brief window of opportunity that they had before it was too late. But the lessons from Helios 522 were quickly implemented. Boeing updated the 737 maintenance manual to state explicitly that after a pressurization test, the pressurization mode selector had to be returned back to auto, closing the door to a previously implied step that could be missed. On the operational side, regulators required that the normal checklist and emergency procedures would be revised with stronger emphasis on immediate oxygen mask use and treating any in-flight cabin altitude warning as an urgent, oxygen-first problem. But regulators also targeted the design ambiguity that had helped trap this crew. The FAA issued an airworthiness directive requiring the takeoff configuration warning and cabin altitude warning to be paired with separate warning lights in front of the pilots so the crews could instantly tell which one of the warnings that they were hearing. But for Helios Airways, this crash was more or less the end, and in late 2006, Cyprus seized the airline's assets over unpaid taxes, grounding it forever. The tragedy of this flight and the dramatic end of Helios was the outcome of an airline whose safety culture had been quietly eroded over time. Absent management, weak oversight, and a pattern of unresolved deficiencies had meant that individual errors and shortcomings were rarely caught, questioned, or corrected before they could line up into something much, much worse. Helios 522 wasn't a mystery failure or a dramatic mechanical breakup. It was a modern airliner doing exactly what it was supposed to do after organizational safeguards, crew training, procedures, and system designs had all failed. And then there was Andreas Prodmorov. For a brief, heartbreaking moment, he was the only conscious person on board a fully intact airborne jetliner. A situation so rare that in my knowledge it has never occurred before and hopefully will never happen again. He had no time, no margins and no help, just a failing airplane and the awareness that he was the only hope for everyone on board. And still he tried, because doing nothing was unthinkable. So Flight 522 didn't end with a rescue or a miracle. It ended with an act of human courage in the face of certainty and a reminder that heroism is not defined by outcomes, but by effort. Andreas Prodmorou wasn't able to save this airplane, but he still fought until the very end, never giving up, which is exactly what every pilot is trained to do. And that, more than anything, is why this story has stayed with me and why my team and I decided to remake this video with better design and graphics, because frankly, this story really deserved it. Thank you all for watching. Now, my team now includes over 15 people, working tirelessly every day to create the best possible content that we can. And we love every second of it, but we also need further help and support, and that is kind of where you guys come in. If you want to help, then sign up to my Patreon crew by scanning this QR code or by going to patreon.com/join/mentorpilot. If you do, you will both support us financially and get to preview all of our videos and add valuable feedback. Thank you so much to all of my already existing Patreons out there, and a heartfelt welcome to anyone new signing up. My name is Peter Hörnfeldt and you're watching Mentor Pilot. Have an absolutely fantastic day, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.